Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Cory Olson, Alberta Bat Program Coordinator, will be talking about bats, prairie bats and their conservation in a changing landscape. And I'm really looking forward to today's presentation. But before I begin, I'd like to state we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For a millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation and it has anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Our next speaker series will be in July about bull snakes by Noah Johnson, and registration details will be available soon. And if you love bats as much as I do, don't miss our August webinar by Brandon Berta with the University of Saskatchewan, and registration is now open on the PCAP website. I'd also like to mention that Native Prairie Appreciation Week is right around the corner. So this is an annual event that PCAP celebrates from June 14th to 18th. And a highlight of this event is our social media photo contest. So check it out on the website, and the date deadline to submit your photos is June 11th. So right around the corner here. During Native Prairie Appreciation Week, PCAP will also be hosting a series of webinars, and you can register for these webinars through the PCAP website, and topics include everything from native prairie gardening and species at risk. I would like to note that past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. Financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, Sask Energy, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Camp Wolf Willow, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I'd like to let all of our listeners know that if you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard, and questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you are on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer. Now, a bit about today's presenter. Cory Olson is a professional biologist and the Alberta Bat Program Coordinator with the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. He has focused on bat conservation and research for over a decade, beginning with his graduate research on bats at the University of Calgary. He co-founded the Alberta Community Bat Program, has led numerous bat inventories across Western Canada, including Saskatchewan, and co-authored several reports and management documents on bats, including Alberta and federal status reports for bats that are currently underway. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Cory.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. I just need to share my screen here. Right. Can everyone see, or can someone see the screen right now?
Yes, looks perfect.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to be talking about prairie bats. I'm the, as you mentioned, I'm the program coordinator for the Alberta Community Bat Program. This is a project of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada that we started in collaboration with Alberta Environment and Parks to try to improve the management of bats in Alberta. Over the last year or so, and we'll continue into the summer, we are expanding our operations to include some projects in Saskatchewan. And that will include a survey of the bridges in Saskatchewan. We've already completed a report of looking at practices of the pest control industry in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And I myself, in working with the national parks, have completed an inventory in Prince Albert National Park and Grasslands National Park. So I will try to bring in some of our findings from Saskatchewan as I go through this presentation. Anybody wanting more information on our program, and especially access to our resources, most of which are relevant to Saskatchewan, can go to our website, albertabats.ca, click on the first icon, and that will bring you to a directory of all the resources we have. We have a number of guidebooks with fairly comprehensive information. We have one on managing bats in buildings, we have one on bat houses, and we have one that provides some information on promoting bat-friendly environments in urban and rural areas. I thought I would first start by describing what makes functional bat habitat. I think when most people look at this scene, it's Dry Island Provincial Park in Alberta. When most people look at it, they can recognize that that's probably fairly functional habitat for bats. But in a lot of other areas, it's a little bit less clear whether that is functional habitat for bats. All bats require access to 3 key resources, same as most wildlife. They need food, they need shelter, and they need water. In Canada, all of our bats are eating bugs, so insects and spiders, and their diets are fairly diverse, but they're only eating bugs, spiders, and insects. They're not eating nectar, they're not eating fruit. There's bats that eat those items in the tropics, but not in Canada. They're all eating bugs. Diets are diverse though. They'll eat anything pretty much that they can get into their mouth. And those are primarily the insects that are out flying during the night. Moths as a group are probably the most important, but they're also, some bats are also eating lots of mayflies, caddisflies, beetles, things like stoneflies, and especially dipterans like midges and mosquitoes and flies and things. And all bats need shelter, and we call the places that bats roost during the day, or that bats, we call structures that bats are using during the day roosts. Before people came, most bats would have roosted in trees, and in some areas they also would have roosted in rock crevices. Now that people have built lots of structures, some bats are making extensive use of buildings, some are using bat houses, and some are using bridges. But historically, it would have been mostly trees and sometimes rock crevices. And they need access to water. Water not only provides a source of drinking water, or it provides not only a source of water for drinking, but it also supports food webs upon which bats depend. All the bats drink while in flight, so they skim the surface of the water and then they simply drop their mouth down and get a gulp of water that way. So they're not landing to drink. That means that they need access to open water free of obstructions, so no duckweed. And it needs to be relatively still so that they can reach the water without crashing into a rapid or something like that. Now, all of those resources need to be integrated into a landscape in such a way that bats can access them. And in the absence of people, most landscapes would be fairly functional for bats. This would be a high quality bat habitat shown in the diagram here. This is a boreal wetland complex. You can see there's lots of water, lots of trees for roosting, and there's lots of food. Anybody who's been in the boreal would probably not question whether there's enough food for bats. As we move into agricultural landscapes, it becomes a little bit less clear if those habitats are functional for bats. In this case, there probably are bats around. There's a water course in the center. It's treed, so the bats would probably follow this treed corridor and forage for insects that are along this water course. They're probably not venturing far into the cultivated field, but at least there is some degree of functionality in this habitat. Now we look at this one, where most of the riparian vegetation has been stripped for agricultural production. It's far less functional. They're probably not making great use of this water course, or at least at levels far less than they would have if the vegetation was intact. And simply by restoring the vegetation along this water course, possibly the value of the habitat for bats could be greatly increased. In an area like this, which is a coulee system along a prairie river valley, you might question whether that is usable by bats. And in fact, there are a few species that specialize on these sorts of habitat. The long-eared myotis would be quite common in these sorts of habitats. And there is one species, the western small-footed myotis, that appears to specialize in those habitats. So what work in Alberta by Cory Olson has found is that each section of coulee is often colonized by a matrilineal lineage of western small-footed myotis, so a mother bat and their descendants, and their female descendants. So these are really important resources. So these coulee systems are important resources for supporting the western small-footed myotis. There's often not a lot of trees, but they don't need trees for roosting. They're roosting in the eroded slopes of the coulee. So as water flows down these coulees, they create little erosion holes that the bats can crawl in and roost there. Or they might just roost under a pile of loose rocks. In this case, in the image on the right, it's a rattlesnake hibernaculum, in this case in Grasslands National Park, where bats have been observed on trail cameras crawling out of. We did winter monitoring at this site, and it also appears that either this cavity or a cavity nearby is used for hibernation by western small-footed myotis and probably east long-eared myotis and possibly even big brown bats. The prairies have 9 species of bats. In Alberta, we know that there are at least 9 species of bats. In Saskatchewan, I believe there are 8 documented. And the status of the long-legged myotis in Saskatchewan is uncertain, but given that the species occurs really close to the Saskatchewan border, it's pretty likely that it does occur in Saskatchewan, which would give the province 9 species of bats. I should say at least 9 species of bats, because there's always the possibility that additional species are coming up from the south, from Montana. Looking at these species, there's 3 species that are long distance migrants, meaning that they're not spending the winter in the provinces. They are instead leaving the province during the winter to find someplace warmer. They might still hibernate there, but they're not hibernating, or they might still hibernate when they reach their winter habitat, but they're not hibernating in the province. These are the eastern red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat. There's a Kosiwik status report that is in development. I was one of the authors, and the status of that species will be assessed over the coming months or possibly years. The little brown myotis and the northern myotis, as many of you know, has already been listed as endangered under Schedule 1 of SARA, primarily because of the devastating effect of white nose syndrome. And then there's two other species, the western small-footed myotis and the long-legged myotis, whose status is largely unknown. NatureServe gives those species a rank of S2, meaning imperiled in Alberta and Saskatchewan, except for the long-legged myotis, which has an undetermined rank in Saskatchewan. So just because of their limited distribution and a low number of reports, their status is believed to at least not be certain. That means that only of those 9 species, only the big brown bat and the long-eared myotis is not presently a conservation concern, which is a little bit alarming given how important bats are to our biodiversity, to see that all the species are, or that most of the species are a conservation concern. Monitoring programs for bats are not nearly as well established as with birds. They are, so the birds have the breeding bird surveys and the Christmas bird count. Birds in general are relatively easy to survey because they form discrete territories which can be monitored using song surveys. Bats, it's much more difficult. There's far less funding and the programs are less well established. There has been recent efforts because of the impact of white nose syndrome and wind energy to develop a continent-wide monitoring program, and that is well underway, and that's called the North American Bat Monitoring Program, or NABAT for short. BC has the most established program in Canada. Alberta has a fairly well-established program, and if anyone wants information on that, they can go to albertaebat.ca. Bat monitoring programs rely heavily on acoustic detection. That technology has been advancing quite rapidly over the last few decades, and now we're at the point where we can monitor bat activity fairly continuously over a several-month period and generate high-quality recordings that are suitable for analysis. This is a very typical setup. This is one I set up in the mountain parks. So it's a 15-foot pole. The microphone's mounted at the top. The detector unit's a little bit lower. And this is a car-mounted bat detector. The NA Bat program uses two different methods for monitoring bats. One method is this passive monitoring stations, where a bat detector is kept in one place for at least 4 days, but it could range up to several months. And the other approach are these mobile transects, where the car is driving while detecting bats during the night. You might imagine that monitoring along roads is going to be highly biased, but it does have the advantage that the car can move faster than the bats can fly, meaning that bats only get detected once, which is essential for creating an index of relative abundance, rather than with the passive stations, which are only capable of providing an index of activity, meaning you can tell whether a site is active, but you can't tell how many bats are there. The topic of acoustic monitoring in bats could span several days. I just want to provide one cautionary note that acoustic detection in bats is not a magic bullet. Many bats cannot be reliably identified to species. Some can, but most cannot. There are automated acoustic identification software packages that will provide an ID, and a lot of those are incorrect, but it takes someone with a lot of experience to tell when they are incorrect or not. So that's potentially could result in a lot of false information on where species in the provinces are occurring. The only reliable method of getting species ID for a lot of our species is to capture them. And the most common method for that is to use these mist nets. Same technology as used for birds, maybe just some slight alterations. It's a lot harder to catch a bat than it is to catch a bird, but it is still effective for a lot of the species. And by capturing them, you can also get information on sex and age and body condition, which would not be available from acoustic monitoring. There are a number of threats that could be affecting our bats, but the three I want to highlight are wind turbines, white nose syndrome, and habitat loss and degradation. Habitat loss is not unique to bats. It's affecting a lot of the prairie species, but the first two are threats that are uniquely affecting bats. Wind turbines, I don't want to go into great detail, but it is likely the most significant threat facing our long-distance migratory bats, so the hoary bat, silver-haired bat, and eastern red bat. These species are migrating out of the province during the fall, and it appears to be during the fall that most of these fatalities at wind turbines are occurring. The blades on the turbines are traveling at hundreds of kilometers an hour. The bats flying through the prairies appear to be drawn to these turbines. Possibly they're perceiving them as trees or some resource that they require. And they are approaching the turbine blades, or they're circling around the turbine and encounter the blades. They get struck by the blades, or they enter a zone of low pressure that causes respiratory damage, and then they fall to the ground. So the image in the lower left-hand corner is a silver-haired bat that was found below a wind turbine, and that's a very frequent occurrence. Estimates for the prairies is that somewhere in the range of 11 bats per turbine are killed annually each year, which is quite substantial when you consider that there are over 1,000 turbines on the prairies. So that is potentially over 10,000 bats per year, migratory bats per year, being killed by turbines just in Alberta and Saskatchewan alone. This rate of fatalities is believed to be unsustainable. There has been a monitoring program, or there was a modeling project that was published in 2017 that used estimated population sizes and empirically derived fatality rates to try to determine how the fatalities at wind turbines could be affecting populations. And the conclusion was that under the most likely population sizes that we could see declines of over 90% in the next 50 years. This estimate is likely conservative because it didn't factor rapid build-out that's occurring in the industry. We're projecting, just based on targets and projects in development, that the amount of wind energy on the prairies could increase by potentially as much as 3 times over the next decade. And that's not likely sustainable. So modeling, more updated modeling has suggested that we're likely to see declines under any plausible range of population sizes, and we most likely have already experienced as much as a 50% population decline. The extinction, whether wind energy poses an extinction risk to these species depends on the population size, which is largely unknown. If the population size is on the lower range of plausible estimates, there is a legitimate risk that hoary bats and possibly silver-haired bats could go extinct. If the population is larger than we are on the larger range of what we think is plausible, then they might be able to persist long enough for new technologies to be implemented. The other threat I wanted to talk about is white nose syndrome. This is a fungus that was introduced around, I believe, 2006 or 2008. Since that time, it was introduced to New York, and since that time, it's been spreading state to state and province to province, and it's been expanding across the continent. And it's not in Alberta or Saskatchewan as far as we know, but it is coming awfully close. And what happens is the fungus colonizes the bats while they hibernate. It causes them to arouse from hibernation at more frequent intervals. And they, in so doing, deplete their fat stores, and they end up starving before they can emerge from hibernation in the spring and begin foraging on insects. So caves where this fungus has occurred, some of these caves have housed tens of thousands of bats, and the vast majority of those have died out. Of the species that occur on the prairies, the most impacted are little brown myotis and the northern myotis. The northern myotis is a species of the boreal forest, so it would occur in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta, but not likely the prairies. The little brown myotis is ubiquitous. And in the east, where this fungus has first occurred, millions, well over 10 million bats are estimated to have died from this fungus. This is a range map. So this shows the progression of the fungus across the years since it started in 2006. And you can see that there has been recent detections along the northern border of Montana, pretty much right on the Saskatchewan border. I would guess that it's likely that the fungus will not respect the national border and has probably already crossed over into Saskatchewan, but because of limited monitoring opportunities, it has not yet been detected. But I think it's likely that it will be detected within the next year or two. It's also in Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba, also very close to the Saskatchewan border. So its status in Alberta and Saskatchewan is not well known. We are implementing a monitoring program this year in both provinces, so hopefully we can get a detection, or at least detect if it's present. Hopefully it's not present, but it is important for monitoring programs to determine when the disease arrives to help us better understand population trends that are resulting from that disease. This is a cave. This is Catamount Cave, Alberta's best known bat hibernaculum. This is closed to the public, so people can't go there now. But if you were to go there, as we have over the last few years under permit, you would see little clusters of bats during the winter, which are hibernating. There's an estimated 1,500 bats in this cave, and often they're in little clusters ranging anywhere from 2 to maybe 50 individuals. Sometimes they also crawl into little crevices in the rock. And we think that most of the bats on the prairies are probably not hibernating in caves, but instead are hibernating in deep rock crevices, perhaps along river valleys and cliffs or other areas where there's fissures in the rock. And perhaps this scene right here where the bat is huddled within a rock crevice, perhaps that's the more common way that they are hibernating, although this one right here is in a cave itself. A lot of research has occurred at Catamount Cave. As I mentioned, there's only 1,500 bats, which is a trivial portion of the bat population that we have, but it is very important as a site for research. We've collected bats over the last few years to get some metabolic information for parameterizing a model on white nose syndrome survivorship. It's also been a site where monitoring for the fungus that causes white nose syndrome has been ongoing. There's also, at least before COVID, there was annual counts of this hibernaculum as a way of monitoring bat populations. And work in the, there's also been lots of work in the 70s and 80s by Tim Showalter and others. And as part of this work, there was a massive banding program. Those are not as common anymore because of concerns with mortality from banding. but there has been a fair bit of data collected as part of that banding program. There's been band recoveries from Catamount Cave as far east as just about Edmonton. So they're traveling over 200 kilometers in some cases there. There's also other banding data from across Alberta, not just to Catamount Cave, but other projects. And some of the banding recoveries for long-eared myotis, big brown bats, little brown myotis, some of these have ranged well into the hundreds of kilometers and upwards of almost 500 kilometers. So we tend not to view those as a migratory species, but clearly if they're making movements of over 500 kilometers, that they are indeed long distance migrants, just less long distance than the 3 species I talked about earlier. One of the more interesting observations or band recoveries was a bat that was banded a little over 38 years earlier at Catamount Cave, and then so 38 years later it was rediscovered alive. The band was red, and based on the fact that it was already a year old when it was banded, it's estimated that it must have been at least 39 years old, which is, as far as I am aware, the record for North America. So these bats and bats in general live very long lives. They reproduce very slowly, but they live long lives to make up for that slow reproductive rate. There's not a whole lot we can do to stop the spread of white nose syndrome. There are some treatments in development. They may or may not be a magic bullet, probably not. But what we are focusing on is to try to build resiliency in our populations. And that is the objective of our program in Alberta, and the objective of a lot of other bat conservation programs, is that if we can't stop the fungus or the disease, that we can at least try to reduce the number of cumulative impacts that are adding on to that mortality. We can ensure that they have functional habitat. We can reduce the number of threats that contribute to fatalities. And we can ensure that the bats that survive, especially the ones that have resistance to that fungus, have high reproductive success. In the case of the northern myotis, they are up in the forest. They're probably impacted by forestry, but they're not directly impacted by the activities of ordinary people. And a lot of our other myotis species are potentially also vulnerable to white nose syndrome, but are likewise out of harm's way from a lot of the activities that people do. Little brown myotis, however, are unique. They use buildings quite extensively. In developed regions of the province, we think that the majority of the bats are probably using anthropogenic structures, especially buildings. They also use bat houses. In some cases, there's bat condos. A lot of bats use umbrellas, folded up patio umbrellas. And one thing we're increasingly realizing is that a lot of bats are also using bridges. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. So the 3 species, we have a program, a citizen science program in Alberta, where we encourage submissions of guano samples, which I'll talk about in a bit. But the short of that is that about 85% of the bats we get reported using buildings in Alberta are little brown myotis. The remainder are mostly big brown bats. We don't have data for Saskatchewan. It's possibly similar, or possibly big brown bats are a little bit more common in Saskatchewan. But it's still likely those 2 species that are using buildings most often. This bat on the right is from Grasslands National Park. It's a long-eared myotis that was found roosting in one of the old park buildings. So evidently they do use buildings as well. We found colonies in the mountain parks and buildings there. So a lot of other bat species might use buildings as well, but it is really 2 species that comprise most of the observations. Long-legged myotis also use buildings. There's a webcam at the Palisade Center in Jasper that you can Google and find and watch them in real time. But there's not a lot of observations of long-legged myotis anywhere, and there's none as far as I'm aware in Saskatchewan. This is a typical building used by bats. If you were to go up if you go into the building and look up, this would be a very common sight. This building has about 100, but they form clusters. They're huddling together for warmth and protection. Some buildings have massive colonies. This is a church in Alberta. and it's likely been using this structure for many decades. It has a pile of guano on the floor of the attic that is well over half a meter deep. This is one of the only sites I've seen pea stalactites or piecicles hanging from the ceiling. You might imagine that in some of these cases, the bats are not terribly appreciated in buildings, but in some cases, they're welcome residences, or they're welcome to stay in those buildings. Regardless of whether people like bats or hate them, or whether they even know if they are there, there's lots of hazards associated with living near a human community. One of the top hazards is entrapment. If they might crawl into a chute or a chimney and then become trapped. Often they fall down, but the sides are too smooth to crawl up. Rain barrels and water troughs are major threats. Invasive species like burdock can be a threat to bats. They get entangled on the burrs and can't get loose. House cats are a major threat. We haven't quantified how many bats are being killed, but they are regularly reported to our program and to wildlife rehab centers, so the threat is likely serious. Sticky tape is known to kill bats, and each year I get people telling me that they're sucking bats out of their building with a shop vac, so I don't think we can ignore the threat of deliberate human persecution on our bat populations either. Barbed wire kills bats. It seems to be mostly hoary bats, and it's usually the top strand of barbed wire that catches them. But again, we haven't been able to quantify this threat. Maybe it's only a few hundred per year that are killed, or maybe it's hardly any, or maybe it's in the thousands. We really have no data one way or the other, but there are regular occurrences across North America of that happening. This is just another bat drowning in a rain barrel. They try to fly in to get some water, end up crashing, and then the sides are often too smooth for them to grip. So in this case, simply putting a wood plank or something for them to crawl up would have saved that bat. But in the absence of that, the only way it can be saved is if somebody observes them. So it probably kills a fair number of bats, but we don't really know how many. We have quite a few recommendations for controlling all sorts of hazards as part of our guidebooks on our website that I encourage anybody to read who is interested. Our most important recommendation, though, has to do with how bats are dealt with when they have to be evicted from a building. These bats are welcome to stay, but others are not. The most important thing that we're encouraging is not necessarily for people to keep their bats, because in a lot of cases, it's not appropriate to have bats in a particular building. But there are some important steps that can be taken to greatly reduce the harm that exclusion is having on bats. And the most important part is not to disturb them while they have pups in the roost. Pups can't leave without their mother, so if the mother is excluded, the pups will surely die and begin decomposing, which often creates more problems for its owners. And the best way is usually to just wait until the bats leave for the year. Most bats don't hibernate in buildings, but more on that later. Little brown bats very rarely, if ever, roost in buildings during the winter. So if those are present, just waiting until October, possibly even November, and then doing the repairs and renovations to get them out of the building is the best option. And then in the spring, they won't be able to get back in, so they'll have to find somewhere else to go. Bat houses can help mitigate that exclusion, but they have to be installed well in advance of the exclusion. Here's some data from a roost in northern Saskatchewan. This is a large little brown Myotis maternity colony, and we only started monitoring this one in July, but you can see that there is a trend towards increasing activity towards the end of July. Probably right at that peak is when the pups were flying along with their mother. So when the pups begin flying, there's a peak in activity, and then they'll learn to feed on insects. And as soon as that happens, which happens quite rapidly, that colony will begin to disperse, and then they'll head to their winter habitat. So this is a fairly similar trend. In this case, some bats are still active into August, but by September, there's hardly any bats using those roosts. This is from Alberta. It has a longer time series. And what this is showing, this is pretty typical across a lot of the sites we see. The bats return sometime in April. Possibly they could, in some areas they might return as early as late March, but most of these bats are beginning to return in April and May. And then their activity builds up in June. There's not a lot of insects, so they're not terribly active, but their activity builds up into June, peaks around July, and then again in August, once the pups can fly, that colony size plummets, and then by September sometime, that colony is largely dispersed. So in this case, this is just data collected using a roost logger. It's an acoustic detector shown in the lower right-hand image. It's just attached to the building and records them as they exit. These are free-flying bats, so not associated with a roost, and this is all bats, so hoary bats, silver-haired bats, myotis, all the bats. This is in Prince Albert National Park at 4 different sites. And the only thing I want to get from that is that they're pretty active in the fall. Sometime in August, you get a huge migratory spike, but almost all of the species become very uncommon, or at least not very active by the end of September. And then in October, there's hardly any bats that are still active. However, to complicate things, there's the big brown bat. And many here might have heard of the large big brown bat colony extracted from an ice rink where they were hibernating. But a lot of the big brown bats do appear to hibernate in buildings. And we don't have great information on how frequent that is or what buildings they're using. But we do know that if you go into a community where big brown bats are present during the winter, that you can detect them throughout the winter. So in this case, we have an acoustic detector. This is in Waskesiu throughout the winter. This is just along the beach. And what you can see is they're active all throughout the winter, but it's mostly restricted to warm nights. So whenever it's warmer than about -4 or so, some bats are out flying, and we don't know why they're flying. Possibly they're just changing hibernation spots, or maybe they need to get a stretch or pee or something. But they are active, so they can be detected, and we know from that they're likely hibernating in buildings because there's not a lot of other structures around for them to be hibernating in. And I would guess that the majority of the communities in Saskatchewan and probably Alberta, this would be a fairly regular occurrence where you would have bats being active on winter nights because they're hibernating in buildings. Obviously, if they're hibernating in a building, then evicting them during the winter is not a great choice. So in those cases, probably a spring or a fall exclusion using one-way exits where they can leave but not re-enter would be the best option. But again, even in the case where big brown bats are present, you do not want to do any work while the pups are present in that roost. We encourage bat houses to be used in cases where there's an exclusion. There's been a lot of work on bat houses and whether they're should be encouraged or not encouraged. 2 designs that are really common are these single-chambered bat houses and these multi-chambered bat houses. There are other designs as well. So here's one example where we have a 4-chambered and a single-chambered, and then 2 small junk bat houses bought at a utility store. And I won't go into detail as to what we found, but the single-chambered bat houses appear particularly bad at overheating. And in this case, what we found is that the single-chambered bat house is exceeding 40 degrees Celsius on the inside for most days of the summer, which is clearly not good for the bats. So we're not encouraging the single-chambered bat houses to be installed. And what we are encouraging instead is that, what we're encouraging instead is that people install large multi-chambered bat houses, that they install more than one. One can be in a sunny location, one can be in a shaded location, and ideally more than 2. And to restrict their use to locations where there's a specific objective. So maybe the natural roosting environment has been destroyed, or maybe there's bats needing to be excluded from a building. But possibly in areas with native habitat, maybe bat houses are not the best option for those locations. We do know that bat houses will attract little brown myotis, which may compete with other species. But if bat houses are used, then we're encouraging large multi-chamber designs and using more than one to prevent situations where they're forced into these bat houses that are prone to overheating. We have in Alberta, and actually British Columbia, we have a citizen science program that we've been running for over 5 years. And as part of this, we're encouraging people to submit a sample of guano to us, along with a report documenting individual roosting sites. And that guano can be sent for DNA barcoding so that we can determine species. That allows that data to be attributed to a specific species, which makes it far more useful than if we're just guessing what bat species it is or whether it was even a bat. Our website has detailed instructions and protocols that anybody who is interested could go on and look at. But it was this data that made us realize that the majority of the roosts that people are encountering are occupied by little brown myotis, and then the most of the remainder is big brown bats. Sometimes silver-haired bats get reported. They often use buildings during migration, but not as sites for raising offspring. And in some areas of Alberta, we also have long-legged myotis. This year, we're expanding our guano sampling to include some more ambitious targets. And so this is kind of the year of guano for us. We're doing a massive survey of bridges across Alberta and Saskatchewan and using guano that's deposited at these sites to try to improve range information for bats. These sites can also be locations where we test guano for the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, Pseudogymnoscus destructans, or PD for short. We're also collecting guano from roosts, especially in agricultural areas, and sending that for meta-barcoding to determine what bats are eating. And we have a number of other projects that also rely on these guano samples. So bridges, there are thousands of bridges across Canada, especially in the prairies, and we've already been sampling dozens of these bridges, and it appears that most of the bridges crossing rivers are used by bats, at least in the regions that we've looked. So most of these bridges that we've looked at have had bat guano. This is a typical example. It's a concrete bridge. You look underneath, you got these beams and the upper deck made of concrete, easy for bats to grip. If you look on the sides of these beams, you can see little black pellets, and that's bat guano. Looking closer, that is what you would see, little guano pellets stuck there. And what bats are doing is they're using these sites as night roosts. Some bridges are also used as maternity colonies, but a lot of them are used as night roosts. So these are bats that are visiting the site during the night as resting sites. Most bridges are crossing rivers, which is productive bat foraging habitat. So they're using these bridges as resting sites to digest their meals. And possibly a lot of different bats are doing this, perhaps more than the little brown myotis and big brown bats, but we'll know that when our project is completed. So those guano samples are going to be sent for DNA meta barcoding, which will allow us to identify hopefully all the species that are using bridges, even the rare species. This is another bridge. This one has these adjacent box beams that create little channels along the deck. And these are perfect for bat roosting sites. In this particular bridge, if you look between one of those crevices, as I did, you'd see a big brown bat. This was during the fall, so it probably wasn't a maternity colony, but it may very well have been occupied in the summer by a maternity colony. In Saskatchewan, we found a large maternity colony of about 500 bats using a bridge very similar to this one, just a little bit smaller, but it has these adjacent box girders or box beams where the bats were hiding and where they were raising their pups. And often these are pretty easy to identify because there's lots of guano below the bridge. This is below the bridge. There are lots of guano all over the culvert. And from that, we can collect a sample and send that for white nose syndrome surveillance or DNA barcoding to determine what species are in those sites. And we're hoping that that can greatly expand our information of what species are occurring where and the distribution of those species. And possibly even as the project progresses, we can start to identify movement corridors used by bats. We know that a lot of rivers are movement corridors for bats, and so bridge sampling seems like a logical place to do that. Another priority that we're trying to focus on is examining the role of bats as a natural source of insect control in agricultural communities. This year at the University of Calgary ranch, we have bat detectors, and we're going to try to determine whether activity increases when cattle are near those sites. So that'll provide an indication of whether bats are targeting cattle as foraging resources. And we'll be doing guano sampling and setting that again for the DNA barcoding. But in this case, instead of trying to detect bat species, we're going to use that DNA barcoding to determine insect species that are present in that sample, to try to better understand what bats are eating in agricultural landscapes. A lot of farms have old buildings, and those have roosts, so those are logical sites for sampling bat guano for that project. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to stick around for as long as is needed to answer questions.
Thank you so much for the awesome presentation. So fascinating. I learned a lot, and I'm very excited to go and make a new bat house for myself. I only have one, so
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about how I definitely need two. Yeah, so thank you so much for all of the work that you do and sharing it with us today. We do have a couple questions from our listeners. I'll just start with one by a listener named Jason. And he's wondering, what effects would radiation have on bats living in open uranium mines?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's a good question. I don't, as far as I'm aware, nobody has really examined that, so I can't really comment on what effect the radiation itself would have. What I can say is that there, as far as the bat is concerned, there's really no difference between a mine and a cave.
Okay.
So if a mine provides suitable conditions for it to hibernate during the winter, then it's very likely that it will go in there and hibernate. And as to how the radiation is affecting them, I can't really speculate.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's lots about bats that we don't know. And Lori's wondering if there's such a thing as a bat deflector that could be used on the turbines.
There is quite a bit of research being done on mitigation to try to reduce fatalities at wind turbines. So there's a number of research projects examining ultrasonic deterrents, and they are effective. They have, I think, been shown to reduce or to provide or to produce significant reductions in fatalities. It is a challenging technology simply because ultrasound attenuates quite quickly with distance. It's not, those high frequencies don't travel very far, so you need powerful emitters, and they need to be close to the point of impact to really be effective. But there has been some progress on that. There's been some other mitigation done on with regards to wind turbines as well that has been proven effective. Simply shutting them off during the night during migration is one of the most effective measures. But that could be improved even more by turning them off during the low wind speeds when bats are active. So there's a lot of
Seems like
research.
such a simple solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Has anyone quantified, either directly or indirectly, the impacts of light pollution on bats?
Yeah, there has been a number of studies on light pollution, and it's a little bit tricky to tell exactly what's happening. We do know that when there's more artificial lighting, that they are likely to come out later to start feeding. But in the cases where you just have one street lamp somewhere, it could also be used as a foraging resource for some bats. A lot of Cory bats, especially in eastern red bats and some of the open country species, they just fly back and forth all night under street lights. I've seen that in Saskatchewan. I think it's fairly ubiquitous. So possibly those are benefiting. But then there's also the longer term consequence of lighting, which is that it disrupts moth breeding cycles, and possibly that depletes food over the long term. So
Yeah, interesting. Seems like
yeah.
there's more that we need to learn about. A listener named Thuy is wondering if you could provide some information about the migratory patterns of prairie bats.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of effort to try to understand migration in prairie bats, and we know that it starts right around July 15th and then continues into September. As to what their specific migratory pathways are is less well understood, although I think there's likely to be some rapid advancements as we get GPS tags that can fit on a bat more effectively. There has been some work in Alberta showing that they're likely following the foothills, the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, and using that as a flyway. It's very likely that a lot of bats are migrating along rivers. Rivers are important movement corridors, so those are almost certainly going to be important. I've done some work in the Rocky Mountains that where we get a fairly large peak in bat activity through the mountain passes between Alberta and British Columbia of silver-haired bats, which would suggest that possibly they're migrating from Alberta into British Columbia, and from there I don't know where they're going, but possibly towards some of the warm coastal areas. And we do know that silver-haired bats hibernate in British Columbia, so there are little bits of information here and there to suggest that it's happening. In Grasslands National Park, we did get a spike in fall activity of eastern red bats and hoary bats. I think silver-haired bats too, although I need to look at that again. Which suggests that that's a migration corridor, possibly leading to the Milk River. And Prince Albert National Park had a huge spike of hoary bats and eastern red bats and silver-haired bats. So it's clear that there's lots of migration through there as well.
Interesting. Wow. A listener named Alexandra is wondering if you know about recent research, what it's saying about turbine height as a mitigation for bat mortality. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about that because that's getting outside of my area of expertise, but it is generally the case that taller turbines kill more bats. It's also the case, though, that taller turbines are bigger and have larger blades, so it might confound it a little bit, but possibly shorter turbines would kill fewer bats, but I don't want to comment on that too much.
Okay, no problem. We've got lots of questions here. It's great. Nicholas is wondering if long-eared bats have reused migratory roost sites. And he says, we have one that shows up every year at the same time in the same place, and wonder if it's likely the same bat.
I can't comment specifically on the long-eared myotis, but a lot of bats show really high levels of fidelity to specific roosting sites. And that's part of the reason why they're so hard to get rid of from buildings, is because once they get attached to a site, that's their home and they don't want to move. So it would not surprise me at all if during migration they're reusing the same stopover sites year after year. Yeah. Male bats also often roost alone, and they might still use the same site night after night.
That makes sense. How do we best repair or modify buildings that are being used as roosts?
Are you talking repairing to help
like
bats?
Yeah, I guess to exclude them, prevent them from coming in.
Yeah.
Like you're kind of talking about that one-way entry or one-way exit.
Yeah. So that part is really challenging, and what we're recommending is that while bats are still present, stand outside that building at sunset for at least an hour and watch them fly out, and mark and document all the spots that they're using to leave the building. That'll provide great insight as to how they're accessing the building. And then don't do anything until the fall. And then when the bats are gone, and hopefully you can confirm that the person can confirm that they're gone, and then they can begin the repairs. And that part is really tricky. And what the rule of thumb is that if a hole is larger than your pinky finger, about just a little over 1 centimeter, it is a potential entry point for bats, which in really old rundown buildings, those sorts of entrances are all over the building. And you could be looking at tens of thousands of dollars to fully renovate that building and get all the sites under control, which is why a lot of people really get fed up with their bat situation, is because they've been neglecting tens of thousands of dollars worth of renovations and then trying to catch up when they realize that their bat problem is unmanageable. But the number one piece of advice that I would recommend is to be thorough, and attention to detail is critical in those cases because you need to get every last one of those crevices. And we recommend using one-way exits whenever possible, even if you don't think the bats are present, because sometimes people are wrong. And the one-way exits, they could be something as simple as a PVC pipe that's smooth, where they can crawl down and fall out, but they can't grip it to get back in. And there's lots of images of that online.
Okay.
And one-way exits can help prevent them from being entrapped and killed.
Okay. And then Nick has also clarified about, like, he maybe has an old building that's being used as a roost, and how can people best repair or modify buildings that are currently being used if they want to provide a home for bats? So they're less interested in protecting the the
Yeah.
renovation investment, but they want to support the species. Is there something that people can do?
Yeah. Well, I think that's an excellent idea. And a lot of old buildings are suitable for bats. But what bats need is, it can't be too drafty. If it's too drafty, won't be able to retain heat, and then they won't use it. So it needs to be open enough that they can get in, but it can't be like too run down. But what bats are really wanting is a narrow space that they can hide in. A lot of old buildings, the rafters provide these little crevices that they can hide in, but some buildings don't have those. So if you want bats to use your building, then ensuring that there's little crevices would be important. And those can be created by just using some plywood, creating almost like a bat house structure on the inside of the building.
Okay, interesting. That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
One of our listeners is wondering if you're hopeful for bats and white nose disease, and that's a question I have as well. I read somewhere that little brown myotis will be functionally extinct by 2026 or something devastating like that. Do you have any comments about the existence of little brown myotis?
Oh, yeah, I definitely don't want to see I definitely don't want to see white nose syndrome get to Alberta. It's almost certainly going to devastate our bat population.
Mhm.
And I think it's critical that we're preventing the extinction, or the risk that will pose to little brown myotis. So hopefully it doesn't get here. It is going to get here though. The fungus, it's guaranteed to get to Alberta and Saskatchewan. What we don't know is whether that fungus will decimate our bat population as it has in Eastern North America. That part is a little bit less certain. It's possible that the roosting conditions here are not conducive for the fungus to grow and cause mass mortality as it has in the East. So that part is uncertain. What I do want to ensure though is that if the fungus does get here, that we detect it as it's occurring. We're putting quite a lot of effort into monitoring bat populations. That we need to collect baseline data on our bat populations. And if we don't know if the fungus is here, then we don't know if we're collecting baseline data or if we're collecting post-white nose syndrome data. So understanding the progression of the disease is really important for our bats. But little brown myotis, even though they're the most common species, are probably the most functionally important for ecosystems in the prairies.
Thanks for that answer. Ellie is wondering if the fungus will stay in the cave or if it dies out after a while. Like, she's also wondering if bats are able to repopulate the cave after another population has been wiped out. Have you heard of that happening? Or
There is some evidence from the east that some proportion of the bat population is resistant to white nose syndrome, and possibly the
okay,
population is beginning to stabilize. I can't comment too much on how reliable that data is, but some will be resistant. The fungus itself isn't likely to disappear from a cave very effectively because it can live in the soil for years and
oh
years.
shoot.
So once it's established, it's probably not going anywhere. But it is possible that some bats have resistance either because they have a behavioral adaptation that is less likely to result in their exposure to it, or perhaps they have some kind of physiological advantage that allows them to survive.
Okay, that makes sense. So that cave is essentially no longer suitable habitat then if white nose syndromes come into it.
Yeah, at least for the bats that are susceptible to it. Perhaps some aren't susceptible, but can't comment on that.
Okay. Ryan is wondering what research is being undertaken to try and confirm population sizes of um, different species of bats in Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Well, pretty much nothing. The trying to figure out the population size of bats is really, really hard. There's not really a technology that'll be a magic bullet for estimating their population size. Acoustic detection doesn't really work because the same bat can be responsible for multiple detections. So you don't really know when you detect bats, how many bats you're detecting. So that doesn't really work for estimating population size. Mark recapture doesn't really work either because bats are really hard to recapture. So that's not terribly effective. There has been a little bit of genetic work trying to estimate like effective population size, and there is a study for eastern red bats. I think maybe another species now, but that's a pretty coarse method of estimating population size. So we could probably zero in on a reasonable range, but we'll likely never be able to figure out their exact population size.
That makes sense. Sounds very complicated. It's unfortunate. Do you think there's a chance that a treatment could be developed against white nose syndrome?
There is some work, especially in British Columbia. So our own WCS Canada, some researchers in BC, Cory Olson and others, have been working on a probiotic treatment. So you inoculate the bats with a beneficial bacteria or some other microorganism that has a natural defense against the Pseudogymnoscus destructans. And the hope is that by inoculating them with those beneficial bacteria, that they could be given some degree of resistance to white nose syndrome. But that's in its early stages, and it's really hard to tell at this point whether that'll be effective or not.
And how can people best sanitize ourselves before spreading, like to avoid spreading white nose? Is there a best practice that you would recommend?
There are. So researchers entering bat habitats have a number of protocols in place for trying to reduce the exposure to or trying to reduce the risk of spreading PD from one site to another. So in that case, we disinfect equipment, we disinfect clothing, wear gloves, disinfect hands and stuff between bats that we're handling. Researchers, I think, are probably fairly compliant, but there's also other industries that interact with bats. So roofers, pest control industry, they should also be disinfecting equipment. Anything that enters a bat roost or another site with bats needs to be disinfected or should be disinfected between sites. Those entering caves like recreational cavers are usually well aware to disinfect their equipment as well. All the clothing, gear, anything. There's some disinfection protocols for trying to prevent that. The average person probably doesn't very often enter a bat roost or a site with bats unless it's on their own property, in which case they're probably not going to another property to spread that, so it's not a huge risk. But anybody going from one bat roost to another should really be following disinfection protocols.
That makes sense. Thank you. Couple more questions here. Sorry. Robin is wondering if bats migrate to hibernaculums in clusters or groups or as individuals.
You know, I'm not sure that anybody entirely knows the answer to that. There has been a few reports in Alberta. I'm not sure about Saskatchewan, but there have been at least a few reports of large aggregations of bats in the fall, especially along the foothills. And maybe those are groups, migratory groups. So it's possible that some are coming together along their migration route, but I don't think there's a lot of data to say what's happening one way or the other.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Be interesting to find out though.
Yeah.
Jesse's wants to confirm, did I understand correctly that you do not encourage people building bat houses unless you know that bats need to be excluded? Or is this something that you would recommend for people, for citizen scientists, I guess? What are your thoughts?
Well, so there's a program to develop a best management practice document across North America. The WCS Canada and others are leading. And that'll provide more comprehensive recommendations on when bat houses should and should not be considered.
Okay.
In the interim, I've sort of been taking a neutral stance on bat houses. that we don't encourage people to build bat houses except in situations where they're being excluded from a building, because in that case, they're already in an anthropogenic structure, and if you give them nothing, then that's probably going to cause more harm than anything. And I think bat houses are also quite reasonable in urban areas or rural areas with lots of human development, because in those cases, we've already torn down a lot of trees, we've already destroyed a lot of rock roosting habitat, and I think bat houses in those cases could be useful for helping to mitigate the loss of naturally occurring roosting habitat. I don't think at this point, based on a lack of information, that they should be considered for natural environments where there's healthy amounts of trees and other natural cover, because we really have no understanding presently of what attracting hundreds and hundreds of little brown bats is going to do to the other species that don't use bat houses.
Okay. Thanks for that answer. And Rachel has a question that I was also wondering about too. So we talked earlier about the white nose syndrome in caves, and once the bat P. destructant is in there, the cave is essentially contaminated. So are new bat colonies able to detect and avoid caves that have problems with white nose in the past? And if not, will deterrence be used to prevent a new population of bats from utilizing that cave and getting white nose syndrome?
I'm not sure the answer to that specific question, but I think the part I would emphasize is that we don't know where bats hibernate. If you were to combine all the caves in Alberta, I don't think we actually know anywhere in Saskatchewan where bats hibernate, except for maybe that one spot in grasslands. But if even in Alberta, where we know of quite a few more caves, if you were to combine them all together, it would account for maybe 5,000 bats out of the millions of bats we have. So even if we were to somehow manage to prevent bats from using sites that had PD, it would be a trivial proportion of the overall population. So just because of our lack of information, our options for limiting their exposure is almost nothing.
It's unfortunate. Joshua is wondering if you foresee any regulation or legislation coming into play for development projects based on the review of status assessments for eastern red, hoary, and silver-haired bats.
Yeah, if they were to get listed, which is not a decision I get to make, but if hypothetically they were to get listed, that would probably make them a more prominent concern for management, mitigation, and so forth. So I think it would be a little bit more difficult for industry to avoid mitigating certain impacts. However, SARA is federal legislation and bats are provincial jurisdiction. So SARA legislation in most cases has no legal bearing on activities occurring within the provinces. So it's more of a symbolic gesture than something that is likely to have significant impacts on legal requirements. And that's the same way with little brown bats and long-legged myotis, unless the federal listing automatically results in a provincial listing. Might be the case in Saskatchewan, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Wendy's wondering about if bats bite or attack people and cases of disease transmission. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, so the primary concern with disease in bats is rabies, and rabies does occur throughout Canada at very low levels. One thing we often see in the media is rates of like 8% or above being reported as rabies rates, and those are false because they're based on testing of bats already thought to have rabies. It'd be like going to the ER ward and trying to detect a disease prevalence in people.
Yeah.
But there has been some testing of bats found dead at wind turbines, and in those cases, the rates are well under 1%, probably way under 1%. There's also a program in Alberta where they were sampling bats from little brown myotis from building colonies, and the rates there was really, really low as well. So probably in most regions, the rate of rabies is well below 1%. However, the bats on the ground that are displaying, they're not behaving normally, are the ones that people encounter the most often. And those do have a slightly higher rate of rabies. So If you're just in the physical presence of a bat, there's no risk at all. If you don't touch, there's no risk of exposure to the virus. But in a few cases, people either deliberately handle the bat and get bit. I have extensive vaccinations, and all bat biologists would.
I bet.
Sometimes people do foolish things though and try handle them with their hands, and then they get bit, and that's a potential exposure. As would waking up in a bedroom and finding a bat sleeping in the area. In a lot of cases, bats try to find warm objects for staying warm if they're trapped in a building, and a sleeping person would be perfect for that. So that's a concern. It's often cats that bring them into the house, and then they release them in the house.
Oh, interesting. I didn't think about that. What about disease transmission from a dead bat?
Well, I wouldn't say there's no risk, but it would be extremely unlikely. Rabies isn't likely to remain viable on a dead bat for very long.
Okay.
But it's kind of one of those situations is you don't want to be the counter example of the one that proves that yes, it can remain active. So we always recommend that people wear thick leather gloves, regardless of whether the bat is alive or dead, if they have to move a bat, because you don't want to get bit.
Yeah.
In the case of bats, it's especially important because a lot of bats go into torpor when they're stressed and low in energy, or if they're cold. So they go into torpor, so they're dropping their body temperature, and they're not very active when they're in torpor, so they kind of look dead anyways. But they can still bite.
So leather gloves, whether it's dead or alive, because you just don't know.
Yep, that's our recommendation.
That is good to know. Thank you. And Cory is wondering, what is your favorite species of bat worldwide?
Oh gosh, worldwide. You know, I haven't. I've done some bat netting in Belize, and there's a lot of cool bats down there. And the most interesting one was the woolly false vampire bat, which is this massive bat with like an alligator-like mouth. And that one was pretty cool. I haven't been to the old world catching bats though, so maybe some of the flying foxes would be pretty cool as well. The wrinkle-faced bat's a pretty cool one. But I do have to say that the eastern red bat and the hoary bat are pretty adorable.
Okay. So in Canada, those would be your favorites then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I'm going to have to Google the wrinkle-faced bat. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
What's the biggest bat that you've ever seen?
Well, the one that, excluding the ones from the zoo, the largest one was that woolly false vampire bat. I think it's around over 100 grams, maybe 100 or 200 grams.
Wow.
The biggest one in the world is the large flying fox, which is about a 1.5 meter wingspan.
Wow.
Can't show it on
It's
screen.
amazing.
Large.
You know, it's big when you can't show it on screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that we have today. So there's been lots of listeners typing in. Thank you for the great presentation. I just really want to reiterate that. So thank you so much for the fascinating presentation and for all the work that you're doing for bats. And we really appreciate that you took the time to share this information with us today. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone who joined me. I'm happy to share our experiences.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for catching our broadcast today. When you leave, you'll get a quick 1-minute survey about just how you enjoyed the presentation. So if you can let us know and fill it out, we really appreciate that we can report back to our sponsors and keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going into the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.